Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter meeting. We have a great meeting tonight. We have a climate author, Sarah Jaquette Ray, and we are very much looking forward to hearing her speak. But before we do, we have a few things we like to do to kick off of our meeting. And the first is to offer a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to introduce one of our chapter members. I'm pointing the spotlight to members in the chapter tonight, not the leadership team, but other members. And so I want to introduce Cindy Cotter, who is going to give our land acknowledgement. And while she does that, I'm going to show that on the screen so that you can follow along. Cindy?
A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and in the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land, the colonialism that is present in our current system, and calls on us to be mindful of our own present participation in it. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, Quiche, Tataviam, and Chumash tribes.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Appreciate that. Okay, well, this is what you all came for, which is to listen to our guest speak. And to kick things off, I'm going to have Michelle Ringler, our vice chair, give an introduction to our guests. So take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Diana. Well, we're very excited and honored to have Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray join us tonight. Dr. Ray has been a program leader in the Environmental Studies program at Humboldt since 2013. She received her PhD in Environmental Sciences, Studies and Policy with the Focal Department of English at the University of Oregon in 2009. She holds a BA in Religious Studies from Swarthmore College and an MA in American Studies from the University of Texas in Austin. Her first book, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, explores the ways that environmental discourse often reinforces existing social hierarchies, drawing on a legacy of nativist, racial, and ableist exclusion in environmental history. We're pleased to hear from her tonight about her second book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, which is an existential toolkit for the climate generation. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray.
Thank you. Yay. Sarah, we spotlighted you. Ta-da! So that everybody can see you and doesn't have to go look for where you're on the screen. I also stopped the chat because we want to make sure that everybody's focus is on our guest speaker tonight. And we will turn the chat back on when we get to the Q&A portion. So take it away.
That's clever. I like that. That's a good strategy. Thank you. I appreciate creating the conditions for utter focus. So thanks. Hello, everybody. I was really impressed to hear all the things you're doing. So thank you for inviting me into this space to celebrate with you and hear all that achievement. I'm sure it was not easy and took a lot of time and effort outside of what you already probably all do for your normal lives. So that's got to be challenging. So I honor all of that. Thank you also for the beautiful land acknowledgement. Coming to you from Wiyot territory, which is Arcata, California. And the Wiyots and many tribes here, it's complicated tribal history as it is in most places, but they and other tribes here have over millennia, despite a lot of genocide and intentional and violent expulsion and erasure, have done an incredible job making this landscape extremely resilient and continue to do so. So I very much appreciate the beautiful place that I live that is also, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, become a climate refuge for many places because we still have fog. And huge redwoods and really clean air for the most part. So for now, anyway, I'm coming to you from here, and it's been a beautiful day. So a little bit of introductions. The reason I turned my attention from what might have seemed like a little bit of a heady academic topic, that introduction, I thought, oh, that's not the one I would do, but that's okay, because it gives me an opportunity to say, yeah, I was I was involved in environmental justice, environmental humanities scholarship before. So I did my training in the environmental humanities out of my PhD. And I came to environmental studies with a real focus on social justice questions. And that was a lens through which I thought I could do social justice scholarship, teaching, and maybe even activism. And in the time that I was doing all of that, publishing books, trying to get tenure, trying to look like, the types of books you have to do all those things and tick off all the boxes. By the time I had tenure and things were starting to settle and I felt like I could maybe branch out and do anything I wanted, was right around the 2016 US presidential election, and also a real shift in the years before that in the optimism and resilience in my students. And I thought at first, my first instinct around it was that they were maybe lazy or didn't have grit. There was a big theory going around about young people not having grit. You remember that one? I thought, okay, let's teach them some grit, these kids these days, and I came to realize after spending some more time trying to wrangle with this with them that they were in fact just completely, utterly in despair. And that they really could not imagine a future that they would desire, much less thrive in. And all of a sudden, the heartbreak and guilt of that started crashing in. And you may know yourself about that experience of kind of breaking through the layers of denial. And when you finally realize, oh no, this is actually bad, right? So I wasn't really paying attention to climate until they really brought it to my attention to say, I am so upset about this that I can't even focus on class. So I appreciate them. They opened the door, my own layers of denial about climate change, even though I thought I was teaching that stuff, really came to light, and I had to go through my own dark night of the soul, which many of you maybe have already done, around reckoning around the climate crisis and what that really means for your life. So that was where my research shifted, because I thought, okay, this is I got to do something, I got to do something serious here. And I knew that the arena that I had any kind of power over, the only space that I had any sphere of influence, as I call it in the book, was as a professor, as a teacher. So it was what I could do for my students. It was what I could do with publication. And so I thought, okay, what is the priority here? What is the triage thing? Well, I've got to write a public facing book. I can't do the scholarship that just collects dust and, ticks boxes for a file. And I decided after a lot of inner exploration that what I had skill in was not in many of the things you all just described, but that existentially supporting the next generation, or anybody who's doing this work so they don't burn out, so that we have all those resources on the front lines doing all the work and they don't ever deplete, that felt like that's my role. That felt like it could be my role. So I have endeavored, since I kind of did that mission internal work, to think about that as what I'm doing here on the planet and my role in the climate work. So I may or may not do well at that. I have no idea, but that's what I'm trying to do. So that's the spirit with which I wrote a field guide to climate anxiety. It was intended to be accessible. It was intended to be written for young people, but anybody who's really having a lot of these feelings, I think anybody who's read the book will know it's relevant for lots of folks. I tend to imagine many of my audiences as kind of college age students types, but most of us, if we're not college age, have some point of contact with someone that age and are worried about them and are thinking about them. So my hope is that in my formal talk with you, that you will find resonance for yourself, if not for your relationships with these people. And finally, I'd like to say that it is really gratifying. It has given me that sense of what many of you might feel as a kind of sense of purpose in what you're doing. And I want to make sure that we highlight that, because that's what Diana was doing, asking us to celebrate our successes, your successes, I should say. It buoys us, right? And that's the psychology aspect. I want to talk tonight about what is the role of emotions in ongoing long-term climate work. Because it gets short shrift. People don't talk about emotions. They just talk about, strategies and legislation and policy and, 9 leverage points in the system or whatever it is that you care about, right? We don't really talk about the emotional soil from which all of this work must grow and how to cultivate that soil so that the stuff growing is awesome, right? And I think we all need it, not just young people. My book was really a love letter to my students. And I sort of wanted to say, okay, stop asking me to be your therapist. I'm going to write you the book, and then I need to take a break because I'm burning out trying to take care of you. I really took it as a personal failure, personally, which I'm now realizing is a problem, right? That they were not okay and adjusted to the world or happy or feeling hopeful about their futures or thought they could get careers because in a world that is falling apart, right? How do you teach a college student to try to get a job in and get skills in for something for future they have no clue is going to exist, right? The existing economy, much less the planet. So, there's some heavy stuff there. So, and I didn't want to not show up, right? However, I've learned that those responses from them were not a sign of my failure. This sign of them being merely attached to the world, as Britt Ray defines climate anxiety. She says, climate anxiety is merely a sign that you are attached to the world. Woo, okay, so it's not my fault. However, collectively, as you know, so much great things can happen, including a sense of purpose. Along those lines, just because of the spirit of this group, I found it so fascinating in the research that a sense of purpose and the sort of happiness that comes with it, or eudaimonia, as it's often called, is access through community, through collectivity, through not being alone, through feeling like you're with your people, feeling like you're working together, that you're being witnessed and witnessing others and their suffering. That, in fact, turns out to be a more stronger emotional carrot or dopamine hit, or whatever you want to call it, to keep people engaged in work than the sense of your actions having an effect or mattering. Isn't that interesting? So we have this notion that we are tallying up all of our actions. We're doing data-informed, evidence-based proof that we have deliverables and we've achieved something, and all our efforts have come to some kind of manifestation that we can document, right? And maybe also therefore use it to get more funding or whatever, right? But it turns out that the happiness element of this work is not in the getting stuff done, but in the relationships. So I think that's a kind of insight that I thought, oh, that'll blow everybody's minds if we reframed everything so that relationship was the priority. What would that mean? It would change things, right? So I'll get into that a little bit more. I just want to give you a little framing and get us in the mood to think about, emotions, they matter. Just for getting us in the mood, climate anxiety and eco-grief are very pervasive. It's not something that is a private, shameful thing that only you feel. And I know that seems really obvious, but I can't tell you how many groups I come and speak to who think I never knew that was a thing. I didn't know that I wasn't alone. And many people are gaslit about this, right? That, what they shouldn't worry so much about something like climate, right? But it's pervasive. How do we know this? Well, we've started to see the APA document impacts of the changing climate on mental health. We've also seen a lot of recorded data from folks like Susan Clayton around the people who are on the front lines of documenting the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and their mental health, the toll that it takes. We've seen therapists actually starting to write books, like Leslie Davenport's a fabulous book, if you haven't read this, about how to handle this in the therapy room. I mean, if the field of psychology, the practitioner's world of psychology is taking climate anxiety very seriously, you know that something's happening. But it's interdisciplinary. The philosopher Glenn Albrecht, if you know the term solastalgia, you'll know that that's the term that Glenn Albrecht coined. His idea as a philosopher is that because we don't have the words in the English language to account for the human relationship with nature, the emotional words, the emotional granularity, we actually don't see and feel how it is that we're severed from the natural world. And so if we created better lexicon, more words to account for the losses that we feel, the grief that we feel, we might actually be able to do something about it. So solastalgia, if you look that term up, is one of the example, but he's created many, many, many terms, and it's very provocative theories. In popular culture, you have folks like Chris Jordan, a documentarian who, after filming Midway Atoll film with all of the albatross, who have all died because they've ingested so much plastic. You may remember those powerful, poignant photographs. A sort of elegy to the albatross, and a sort of emblematic of how something from so far away where we never go and never see could be affected by what we're doing, right here. That moment of bringing the destruction so close really destroyed his mental health, and he himself spiraled into depression and anxiety. Similarly, we watched Josh Fox in this popular culture film, if any of you are familiar with this, go through this existential journey in this film. So the emotional story around climate is in popular culture as well. If you are not familiar with this show, Big Little Lies, you remember that Laura Dern's 8-year-old daughter was learning about climate change in her classes, the polar bears, and started having fainting spells. And in the hospital, the doctor actually diagnosed her with climate anxiety. So it really went to a whole new level of the mainstream. Recently, there was a study, 2021, I recommend checking it out, about youth and climate anxiety, and that is a poignant story as well. And I'll cite some data from that in a minute, but it's becoming a real topic of study. And we know that the mental health consequences of climate anxiety can be so severe as to induce suicidal ideation and suicide. I know that from my own students, and we know that from the data of young people, and we also can see that in things like the self-immolation of folks like Wynn Bruce on Earth Day this year, and David Buckell in 2017, I believe. And if you don't think climate anxiety was at the basis of Don't Look Up, I'm sure you've all seen this film. Forgive my bad language here, but that, of course, was a meme from this fantastic film that used climate anxiety as a motivating factor for its entire plot line. And Adam McKay was in consultation with many of my colleagues in the world of climate anxiety to figure out how to tell a story that activated climate anxiety for transformation and not just piled on to it. So it's everywhere. We know from all kinds of scientific research, social science, psychology research, and public health research that climate change is and will continue to have effects on mental health. And we see this in extreme weather events that will cause trauma and displacement. We see air pollution causing not just physical health, but psychiatric illness. We see how heat leads to increases of interpersonal conflict and suicide. That might be something mentioned earlier in the comments. And the list goes on, even access to good brain gut foods. So it's not just mental health. We see how this is actually going to kick off, because we know that mental and physical health are not the binary that the medical model would like us to believe. They're in fact very interchanged, and climate change is going to continue to bring that to the fore. So the story of climate change affecting mental health has been the sort of predominant one. But when my students started bringing to me all of their emotional things, I started to wonder if there was another story to be told here. They feel like there is no good that young people can do for the planet, only this concept of impact. And it's interesting, in the world of academia, the most money that you can get from a grant to do studies on climate change come from something called the NSF, or the National Science Foundation. And if you're not a scientist and you want to participate as a social scientist or a humanities person, the area you can get, the kind of grant you could get, is something called human impact of climate change. And that's like such a limited frame, right? I mean, the human impact part makes this next problem so obvious, right? It leads us to this kind of idea that all of humanity sucks. Excuse me for a moment. I just felt a tickle in my throat and don't want to go there. And Karen Litvin calls this the misanthropic temptation. And my students really feel it. And maybe some of you feel it too. This, of course, leads down all kinds of nasty roads, which I'll get to in a moment. They feel that the problems are too big and interconnected, and that people are too small and powerless to fix them. And this is something in my book I call the apathy trap. They feel that we're all past the point of no return. This is something I call the trope of inevitability, which I'll talk about in a moment, because I'm going to focus really in on the idea of hacking the story as one of the most critical existential tools in our toolkit. And most of the science reports that we get around climate change that are trying to use kind of fear and doomism to rally energy and action have the effect for those who are really concerned already of making them feel like we're past the point of no return. Kari Norgaard and others also talk about this point that one would call lack of a radical imagination, perhaps, that it's easier for most Americans to imagine the apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. And the problem with that kind of lack of a radical imagination is that it leads to the inevitability, which also then leads to apathy, or what I consider actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. We certainly will have the apocalypse if we can't imagine anything else. They feel like their life course is unclear and it won't be like previous generations. Similarly, they don't want to bring children into the world. So one of the sort of big stories about this generation that is often talked about in mainstream media is the shock of them not wanting to have children because they genuinely don't think the planet is going to be habitable. And this is really one of the things that's getting older generations to pay some attention to how bad the situation is. There's actually data on this about the number one way to get a boomer to care about climate, if they don't already care about climate, is to withhold the grandchildren card, right? And there's actually there's a movement of people who are using it for that purpose. So it's an actual thing. And I, of course, worry about how all these things lead up to sort of nihilism in my students and young people, where I think there's no way they're going to be able to show up to save the planet if they can't even get to class, right? And so this is a sentiment we really did hear from the youth climate strikes of 2019, where, what was the point of going to class when these problems were so urgent? And that was the point. And of course, resentment, anger, betrayal about older generations and what they're doing. So there's all this whole soup of emotions that kind of, this is how when people say, look, define climate anxiety. What's this stuff? This is the stuff I wanted to write about in my book. This is the stuff my students bring to me. How are they going to be this generation to fix all these problems if this is the stuff they're feeling? So that's what really called me to attention. In specific, this report that came out in the Lancet in 2021 really honed in on not just the fact that young people are going to be disproportionately the victims of climate change, which is true. Women and children will experience the front lines of climate change more than other groups, but that they also, not surprisingly, have more intense climate anxiety around than other generations. Nearly 60% of these 16 to 25-year-olds from around the world surveyed that they said that they felt worried or extremely worried. More than 45% said they had feelings about the climate that they felt the climate affected their lives. 3/4 of them said that they thought the future was frightening, and over half felt that humanity was doomed. Whoops, I don't want to go there quite yet. 1 in 4 actually said that they didn't want to have children because the planet wasn't going to be habitable. And along these lines, I want to sort of sprinkle a little foreshadowing about where I'm going to go with this. It is no wonder that so many people feel this way, given the fact that this is the vast majority of the stories that we hear about climate. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't feel these things, but the stories that we consume about the climate do create our sense of reality, and therefore do increase what the psychology theorists call risk perception. So things that don't, enter our frame as something to be afraid of, we may never be afraid of, even if we should be, right? And there are some things that enter our frame that we're really afraid of that maybe there's very low likelihood of ever happening, right? Like getting an airplane crash or something, right? So what the likelihood of something bad happening versus our perception of whether it's a threat don't necessarily match up. And oftentimes the question around climate change is so interesting because for years and years, people kept saying, how are we going to get people to care about climate change? Well, now we've swung so far to the other direction that so many people care so much that they're checking out. The climate story is so awful and seems so unsolvable that it's no wonder people aren't paying attention, aren't doing anything about it. So, I have a sense of sort of compassion around the denial, not the denial that is actively trying to subvert climate action, but the sort of denial that I kind of live in too every day. I don't really want too much to really face, all kinds of strategies people use to not feel that. Yeah. So one of the things that's happening here, the climate change is going to have an effect on our mental and physical health because things are connected. Any kind of anxiety, chronic or acute anxiety, is going to have these kinds of effects. And those of us who have experienced any kind of anxiety, which is human to do, anxiety is a sign that you are connected to the world, right? It's perfectly legitimate response to difficulty. Knows this is, if you're not familiar with this, is a super helpful tool to think about this notion of the range of resilience, or what Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance, if you're into psychology and you're familiar with that. A similar concept where, as pressure mounts on us, our range of resilience shrinks, and our ability to act in alignment with our values, our ability to create relationships, to go to that earlier point, our ability to take care of ourselves and be healthy gets diminished, right? And we spend more time either hyper or hypo aroused. And you can see here that that's both an emotional state and also a physical state. These are not, they're connected, right? We know anybody who practices mindfulness in this group knows that, the emotion comes with something physical happening to you at the same time. You feel it in your body, and you learn how, interoception, you learn how to feel it, right? So this range of resilience is what the planet needs us to be operating out of, because so many of the decisions and the things that we need to do for the climate are not obvious, immediate, urgent things that are right in front of us. It's not like the saber-toothed tiger is attacking us. That's one of the reasons why climate is a very difficult threat to portray as a threat. And has struggled for some time. And Al Gore really struggled with that, right? He was trying to get everyone to care about this really weird thing that nobody could understand and wasn't right in front of us. So how do we cultivate this range of resilience? How do we build it out? How do we make sure that range of resilience is as big as it can so that we can serve the climate, serve our community for as long as we can with as much energy and skill as we can, and not just out of this constant reactivity, right? This reactivity of, we got stimulus coming in, got a fire to put out there, just chasing our tails, trying to urgently fix all of these problems. That is not an efficient strategy to tackle such a problem as climate. And we know that this has effects on the body. We know that these two things are interlinked. We have the science on it. Medical science knows this, even though the medical establishment and insurance keeps physical and mental health all separate. But the effects of chronic stress on all of the organs, I don't need to detail them all to you, but you know that this is true, right? So the notion that climate change is going to affect our mental health, and that stress in general affects our mental and physical health, this, you can see where I'm going with this, right? I'm thinking about my students. If they aren't well, they're not going to be able to fix these problems, right? And none of us are going to, right? To the extent that we can control these things, of course. And I want to have that caveat always there. And I'll talk about that caveat a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so instead of this notion of just climate change affecting mental health, this other story I wanted to start to think about and explore is, to what extent does our mental health affect climate change? It's it's like a feedback loop. And so one of my dear colleagues put together this awesome graphic to try to describe this, what I'm trying to get at here. If we think of climate disruption kicking off this feedback loop of people being distressed and reactive and not skillful and outside of the window of tolerance, this increases stresses on institutions and systems. We've seen this happen. This is what Joanna Macy calls the great unraveling, which I'll talk about in a minute, right? This is going to kick off the inability to mitigate climate change, which will in effect increase the climate problem. In contrast, if we can use this opportunity of climate disruption to change some systems to focus on inner resilience, we might kick off this opposite feedback loop, where climate disruption actually kicks off our growth, right? Like we think about, post-traumatic growth also is a thing, right? Similar kind of concept here. Decreases structural stress, increases climate mitigation, decreases climate disruption. That's why that triangle shrinks on the right side there. So this thought of, actually, maybe Paul Hawken is right. Oops, sorry. I had a slide in here for Paul Hawken. Where's my Paul Hawken slide? I'll just say it then, because I don't have it in here. So let me go back here. So Paul Hawken, the Project Drawdown founder and author of a new book called Regeneration. His quote, I love it. He says, the most radical, important climate technology is the heart and mind, not the solar panel. And that to me is just like, wow. So much of the work we can do, we can just sit here and do in our own chairs. I know that's a radical thought, but the world of ideas, the reframing of our thoughts, the putting of our energy into the places that we want to nurture and grow, all of this stuff that is mental, that you do on the meditation cushion, or you do in your thinking, or you do in your reading, it translates into buoying our action, buoying our ability to mitigate climate change. It has material consequences. And that's really where I'm really on Paul Hawkins' side on that one. I think our minds and our hearts are climate technology. What if we invested in them the way we invest in green technology? I mean, I get excited thinking about it. But don't take that graph word for it. A better way maybe to understand it is in the words of a 22-year-old Morgan Forsheim. She puts it in a different way in this fantastic Yes Journal article. She says, depression tells us that we are at once powerless and culpable. And therefore, the only logical response is to disengage, turn inward, and eschew connection. A response which only serves to reinforce the oppressive systems like racial injustice and capitalism that are responsible for our suffering in the first place. So this is the feedback loop on the left side, right? That the system is bad. It extracts value and energy from us. We burn out thinking that we can't do anything about it. And it pleasantly and very happily likes us to think we're powerless. So we turn inward, thereby creating the problem even more so, right? So this is really the essence of, Morgan puts it beautifully. So why do emotions matter in our climate work? So let's think back to this, like reversing the flow. Like, why does our mental health matter for our climate work? Well, for one, emotions actually are more integral to learning than logic. And this is, again, my kind of classroom setting, but this is fascinating that this is similar to the research you might be familiar with, that emotions dictate actions and behavior change more than data or reason-based appeals. So this is so interesting because oftentimes, at least I'm living in an enlightenment world where I think that facts are going to get people to change their behavior and do things. And this is often called the information deficit model, right? If we just tell everybody the facts, they'll act in a logical way in response. And it turns out this is totally untrue, and probably in all of your activism, you have experienced that. The science of emotion shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways. And I would add among different communities. So guilt works in some communities better than others. Altruism in general turns out to be a more long-term engaged emotion that brings people back for more than guilt, for example. I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting research on this. Which emotions do we want to use strategically, right? If we start to be way more transparent about the kind of hidden curriculum of the emotional stories we're telling in our actions, we might actually be more effective. And just the simple notion that our interior lives affect our ability to engage in climate work. This is because our brains are pleasure-seeking machines. So how do we make the work pleasurable? And I mentioned this earlier, community is the main thing, right? And climate change is increasingly affecting mental health, and vice versa is also true. So this awareness of we simply can't afford to let mental health slip as part of the arsenal against climate change. It feels maybe like a secondary priority, but I hope I've convinced you otherwise. So Gus Speth puts it this way. I love this because as a person who's done environmental work from a humanities perspective for so long, I've often had to defend what the humanities offer these problems, and here Gus Speth comes out and just says it so beautifully. I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And then he says, and we scientists don't know how to do that. So who knows how to do that, right? Our elders, our wisdom traditions, social movement leaders, all kinds of people know how to do this. There's so much resource out there on how to do this. And the climate movement in general, because it has been usually run by quite privileged people, has not actually had to tap into this deep well of what Gerald Visner, an indigenous scholar, calls survivance, right? This sort of, existential threat of climate change Marianne Ace Heglar, who's one of my favorite climate journalists, she says, stop talking about climate change as the first existential or the worst existential threat of our time. Only people who have not experienced other existential threats would say that, right? So this notion of, there is a well of knowledge here that we can enlist for this work. And these social movements, from Gandhi to Mandela to Martin Luther King, Grace Lee Boggs, know that you need the heart, hand, and the head. You can't just have the hand and the head. So I love that. Oh, here's Paul Hawkins. Yeah, there, Paul Hawkins. Sorry. There's your quote from Paul. I meant to have it earlier. Sorry about that. So what is the existential toolkit for the climate generation, or what's the existential toolkit for climate justice? This is the outline, the table of contents of my book, and I'm going to focus a little bit in on it. I have a real problem here with the slides. I'm sorry about this. Focus in on this chapter 5, hack the story. That's the sort of overarching thing. And I really kind of want to focus on hack the story as a way to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going with this. I want to point out that chapter 7, ditching guilt, moving beyond hope, and laughing more, taps into this whole notion of, if we're pleasure-seeking machines, we need more carrot and less stick to keep us in this work. So hacking the story. I mentioned Joanna Macy, and Joanna Macy is one of my favorite thinkers on this stuff. She's written a book called Active Hope and the Coming Back to Life, and she created this whole methodology around sort of transformational climate action called the work that reconnects, if you're interested in looking that up, if you don't know about it already. And she talks about, one of her activities is called 3 Stories of Now. And what she does is she asks people to imagine how, as they read these stories, this particular version of a story is the Great Unraveling here. As they read that story, how does that leave them feeling, right? We're putting our attention to the disasters, to the Great Unraveling is a story of derangement, collapse. The climate itself is unraveling, 6th great extinction. Hurricanes, wildfires, whole ecosystems are being destroyed, military operations, conflict, famine, drought, refugees. This is the story, of course, that the vast majority, this sounds like truth, I'm sure, as I'm saying this, right? But the effect of that story on most people, unfortunately, is to check out, right? We're going there. So why is that story a particular problem? Well, first of all, it only fuels and meets the demand of the reptilian part of our brain focus on on negative information. We're constantly scanning the horizon as a sort of residual evolutionary thing for the scary threats. And this creates what psychologists call the negativity bias that makes us subconsciously give more psychological significance to negative experiences and stories than positive ones. And it affects our behavior, right? So if we perceive that bad thing is more real than the good thing, that will change what we do in our lives, our actions. So the negativity bias, of course, is not just in our brains, it's in the news, right? Over 80% of climate stories are told in the negative frame. And it makes us feel like we're not honoring truth if we're not talking about the awful things that are happening, right? That is the sort of truth-telling role of a climate activist, right? It feels like that's what we ought to be doing. And so given the politicization of climate politics and climate media, unfortunately, the result is that we have this terrible reinforcing feedback loop between the news media and our negativity bias that has us living in a story of the Great Unraveling. So what is the effect of all this? Psychologists have talked about this concept of pseudo-inefficacy. And pseudo-inefficacy was, when I learned about it, I was like, yeah, that's what's happening with my students. We have to combat this. All stories of the world we live in, none of them are true. They're all partial truths, right? There's no such thing as a true reality of the story we live in. And there are other stories that are true as well around climate that involve things like all the things that you all have just done in the last few weeks, right? The sort of what else is true. And so the question we want to ask around climate stories is not what is true, which is where we mostly spend our time, but what is most useful. If we, in fact, believe the story that the climate is in trouble, which I do believe, the story we actually need to live in is that we are successfully combating this problem, not the Great Unraveling story. Joanna Macy calls that the story of the Great Turning. And the story of the Great Turning has the effect, as you all know, as you gather together, of making people feel like they have efficacy, right? They have some ability to control the conditions of their lives. So pseudo-inefficacy is the opposite. The sense that you have, it's a false sense, that's why pseudo, that you have no power. And that truly is the definition of depression. If you don't feel like you have any power to control the conditions of your life. The idea of pseudo-inefficacy, the definition is the idea that people are less likely to offer help if they think the problem is too big for them to solve. The experiment that was used to come up with this concept and especially apply it to climate change, which is happening in this book that I have pictured here, Numbers and Nerves, talks about the child in the pond scenario, which is extrapolated from Peter Singer's work with the child in the pond. No children were actually hurt in these experiments. I don't know how they did them without, but I'm assuring you that's true. Whereby the vast majority of people, if they're walking past a child drowning in a pond, they are very likely to try to save that child drowning in the pond. However, if they walk past many children drowning in many different ponds, the negative emotions coming with not being able to save all of them outweighs the positive emotions of saving even one, so they won't even save one. So framing the scale as too big, framing the problem as inevitable, framing, the climate crisis as a litany of all horrors that are happening, the sort of negativity bias trope of climate change has the unfortunate effect psychologically of making many of us have this pseudo-inefficacy effect. And some people call it the drop in the bucket imaginary. I'm just a drop in the bucket. Whatever I do won't make a difference. How many people have checked out of climate action because of that? So this is how this works. That negativity bias feeds the story of the great unraveling, which creates the psychological effects of pseudo-inefficacy, psychic numbing, and empathic distress, which all add up to inaction. So this is not a very useful story to be living in, even if it feels somehow like it's true. I know I'm saying a sort of controversial thing here. So in this chapter, I talk about hacking the story. These stories are told in a negative frame. Negativity bias demands the supply of negative stories, right? Eyeballs. As we know, the algorithms of social media really thrive and really proliferate when the emotions attached to the stories, the emotional words that are attached are anger, outrage, and fear, right? This lethal cocktail has us living in a story of apocalypse. And I say it's lethal for lots of reasons. The psychological effects are to give up, chronic stress. Positive stories of solutions are essential for our existential capacity to engage in climate action, but they don't make the news, right? That's why you have to learn about it by joining groups like this and hear it in the chat, right? To truly pay attention to reality, to counterbalance the negativity bias of both our brains and the news, we have to constantly seek and disseminate other stories so we can stay energized. So one way to do that to start is what else is true? Besides the story I'm consuming, what else is true? Here are some faulty story elements that we might want to, not always maybe get a critical lens around as we're consuming these stories. The trope of inevitability, this notion that all humans are the antagonists of the story, right? This does not, painting all humans makes it feel like an impossible thing to overcome, when really the culprits of these problems are like 10% of humans, right? And there are also stories all over the place, especially indigenous communities, like in this picture, of people who are not doing the bad stuff, right? And who are really fighting. And this is a personal sort of, checklist for me too, auditing our attention. Do we give our eyeballs to this stuff? And being really strategic, in most contexts, emotions that build capacity for long-term engagement will be things like pleasure, desire, relationship, celebration. And in most contexts, the use of anger, guilt, other types of emotions that people find uncomfortable in general, do not tend to create behavior change for the long term in general. These are all in general statements. There's always exceptions. And these things are also vary based on geography, race, class, religion, all these things, right? So, some people's experience with this might be, it's not quite my experience, right? But this is where the conservation psychologist is in general. So what do we do about all this? What does the planet need from us? So in my final slides here, it's sort of the checklist, right? This is sort of all the book ideas combined. This is not just to check the story, but to give you a flavor of how much the shift of perspective might lead us to more long-term and effective engagement in our climate action. One skill is that we want to build capacity in our mind and body for long-term engagement. So a breakthrough inquiry or a question you could journal, this is sort of like, how do I get access to that skill? Maybe think about what it would take to shift your energy from scarcity to abundance, right? There's this constant scarcity thinking, this burnout, this overwhelm, this urgency. There is always enough time to do the work that's needed. Adrienne Brown says, move at the pace of trust, right? Mindfulness of our emotions so we know how we can be our most skillful selves. And this feels like such internal work for what purpose, right? But it helps us figure out what our distress points to, helps us figure out where we should put our nurturing efforts. Helps us eliminate the ways that capitalism is showing up through us in our actions. We want to do our thinking and our acting ourselves. We don't want that destructive force using us as a pawn, right? Most of the time we're swimming around and marinating in the soup of all of these ideas and don't even, are too close to it to even know. And so we are in some ways thinking and acting in service of this system that we disagree with, right? What makes us feel like we have and are enough? What does satisfaction feel like? And can you celebrate your abundance more, which you already did today? Adrienne Brown says, more critical connection, less critical mass. And in my book, I think about it as be less right and more in relation. And here this goes to this point. Community trust and collaboration are the medicine for both what ails us socially and what ails the environment. So this is like the root cause of both problems. So what would your work look like if you valued relationships more than anything else? This really changes and goes against the individualism of the sort of dominant American myth of the individual. Hacking the story, again, reframing the problem and the solutions and paying attention to your attention. What else is true? Healing the world with a radical imagination. What do we desire about the future? Can we focus less on the stuff that needs to change and more on the stuff you want to grow? And yeah, you can still focus on the stuff you want to change. I think that legislation stuff is pretty exciting. You want that stuff too, right? But sometimes people are daunted, right? They're daunted by the Sisyphean task of like upending this whole entire system, like Naomi Klein, this changes everything. It feels like too much, right? Well, what about shifting our focus on what we love that we fear might be lost? And can we nurture that thing? That's a sort of a simpler task. I think a lot of people, when they think about that apathy trap of the problem being too big and I'm too small, this is a real avenue for them. Resist urgency. This is again going against the dominant grain of most activism. Relationships with the planet and each other, if we do believe number 3 about community, and they're the medicine, but they take time. So what would it take to slow down enough to prioritize building relationships and trust over productivity, right? And the scale or pace of impact. And accepting paradoxes as more true than binary myths. And that's again a little bit theoretical, but it takes a certain level of wisdom to accept the fact that I might on the one hand be doing really good about saving, about not creating a lot of plastic waste. But on the other hand, I might do this other thing that's not so great for the environment. And instead of undoing myself and unnecessarily burdening myself with guilt, accepting that sometimes we're not going to be totally pure all the time. We're doing our best, right? We're doing our best. Or, for example, and this is my last slide, this Venn diagram activity that comes from this wonderful book called Beyond Survival, of finding ways to find peace with juxtaposition or paradox. A couple from there are being with what is versus everything needs to change. Yeah. Does anyone feel that one? Yeah. Or climate action that just happened, right? The climate action we just saw happening at this historic scale. We should celebrate it. And also all of these other horrible things are happening. And there is cause for boundless grief and rage. And so containing these multitudes in ourselves is part of the challenge. It's part of the task we have. Along those lines, we think about guilt causing us to do this work. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her. She's a Potawatomi indigenous botanist, Western scientist and indigenous botanist. Fascinating book, wonderful book. she calls us to do the work for other reasons than what Western Enlightenment thought makes us think we should do it for. She calls on us to do the work because it's a gift I must give the earth in reciprocity for the gifts that the earth gives me. And she even includes joy in that. I have to cultivate this joy. I have to walk in a world of joy, even though it's wounded. Even in a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And so this notion of trying to walk in a space of abundance and enough, it helps us consume less. It helps us feel spacious to do the work. It helps us be full of our mind and body health, etc. And it is the gift we want to give back to the earth. So thank you. That's the end of my slides. And I hope I have left enough time for some discussion and or responses or like the virtual fruit throwing.
That was fantastic. We've had some really good speakers, but I tell you that this was one of the best presentations that I've seen. Does anybody else, just clap thumbs up, etc.
Thank you.
And I think it also reflects the need for it too. I mean, we've talked about it in our chapter a little bit, but you talk about it with such clarity and provide solutions as we go along. So thank you very much. And of course, we want to get to some questions. And before, I know Michelle has some, I'm also going to turn the chat back on. So if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll come to it. Michelle has a question, but before I turn it to Michelle, I know on your website, you are involved in some things. And if there's anything that you're doing project-wise that you would, we always ask our guest speakers, what can we do to support your work?
Oh, wow. That's very sweet.
So if there's something that you're doing and that you feel that we can support you in, we would love to do that. And I'm not sure what that looks like or how it would be, but we make a connection with you by being here tonight. And we would like to continue that and support what you're doing. It's amazing work and it's very, very important. So you can think about it. You can let me know. I can put that back out to the group. We can make it an ongoing conversation, or you can.
I will answer it. I have an answer.
Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I know it sounds, maybe it might sound corny, but like I said, what came to me in the examination that my students brought me to was, okay, what can I offer, right? The wayfinding folks out of All We Can Save, right? They have a whole wayfinding program helping people figure out what their mission in the climate work is going to be. I love that resource if you're interested in that. All We Can Save, Catherine Wilkinson's work. When I did my own wayfinding, I didn't have the terms for it. I didn't have her resources, but when I did my wayfinding, I was like, hey, let's energize the movement, right? Like, I'm not going to be on the front lines of anything, but I can maybe do some heart and mind technology innovation, right? Like the Paul Hawkins. And, to the extent that you all can do that work with yourselves or in community or in your other communities and ripple that stuff out, right? And embolden the movement, that would help. That's the work I'd like to see, really paying attention to how critical your well-being is for the movement. It is the fuel of the movement, not to use a terrible metaphor. Yeah, and I am teaching mindfulness for transforming climate anxiety through Pacific Mindfulness. If that's something people are interested in, I'm currently getting trained as a teacher in mindfulness through UCLA Mindfulness Teacher Training Program. And so if people want to do that and really dive into that with me in the future, I started this one class I'm doing already, so that one's closed, but the next time I teach it, just look for that. If that kind of support would be helpful for you, I'd love to see you again.
That would be great. And we do a follow-up newsletter that's sort of like, what did you miss? Or here's the recapping. So what we can do, just is we can put some of this information in that section so people know where to go to learn more about that. So
great. Thanks for that, Diana. That's very sweet.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you. Michelle, do you have a question? There's some questions coming into the chat. And of course, Dr. Ray, if you are comfortable picking some, feel free to do that. But Michelle's going to kick it off with one or two to get us started. Michelle?
Yeah, a couple questions. That was really phenomenal, Dr. Ray. I enjoyed it so much personally. I wanted to ask you, you discussed the importance of cultivating curious compassion and also slow hope. Can you share what you mean by that and why you feel it's so important?
Thank you. You've read the book.
Yes.
Yay. Yeah. So when the first epiphany that I had, that relationship mattered more than being right. So as a professor, I used to think, okay, my job is to arm my students with all the best arguments so they can go and persuade everybody to do better, And that is an information deficit mindset, right? And I learned when my students came back from the first Thanksgiving break, when there was this transformation I just described started happening with my students, they didn't want to talk about what we were talking about in class. They want to talk about all of their family ties that had been broken over the break because they're all awakened around climate justice and they're passionate now. I mean, it's kind of classic story, isn't it? You go to college, you learn some stuff, you come home and have some fights with mom and dad, right? But, it was like painful, right? And I thought, what am I doing to them? Why am I destroying their relationships? This doesn't seem like the right way to do this. And so I started studying communication issue, the question of communication, and started reading folks like Catherine Hayhoe's work. Before she just published a book, if you're interested in that. And then the critical work of people who are talking across difference to find common ground to make action happen on climate. That is not easy stuff. Deep canvassing is an example of that, if you're familiar with deep canvassing. And what I learned, and I'm still learning this, is the role of compassion in that. Once you start getting angry and righteous, you've lost. You're not going to get these people. You're not going to get anybody. And compassion is the door through. And you know what? You might just change your mind too. It's possible. There's humility required there too. That's where the curiosity comes in. So instead of thinking of going into war with a communication action, event, if you come to it with an orientation of genuine compassion and curiosity, you're far more likely to have an effect. And it's not just theoretical. There's evidence that shows this, right? When people feel really heard, they're much more open to changing their hearts and minds. And not that our goal is to change hearts and minds. Actually, the goal ought to be to make connection. But, I'm just saying it also has the effect. It tends to be more effective if changing minds is really what you try to do, So that was curious compassion. And compassion has been a real theme for me that I've been working with, and especially in mindfulness work. The second question was slow hope. I think this concept of slow hope. Yeah, slow hope is an idea that I'm sort of pulling from a lot of different thinkers here. Christoph, oh my gosh, I can't remember his last name, out of Munich, and Rob Nixon's work on slow violence. I'm also thinking now of the work of Trisha Hersey, who I did not quote in the book because I didn't know about her work, but she's called the Nap Bishop. She calls herself the Nap Bishop, and she's coming out with a book next month called Rest as Resistance. So I recommend checking that out. But this notion of, I've also just published an article on this on One Earth Sangha called Do Nothing for the Planet. Why do nothing for the planet? That's something, this sort of provocative notion that in this moment of urgency, we actually need to slow way down, because what's happening is we're reacting a lot. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, says, between the stimulus and response, there is a pause. And in that pause is where my power lies, my choice and my freedom. And so this notion that we might act out of that pause rather than just react to out of stimulus, like an immediate reaction, that's a lot of wasted energy. It's like the hose flying around with water, spilling out. It's not watering anything, it's just flailing around with a lot of energy, and the sort of like putting out all the fires and acting out of urgency. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and theologian, talks about the urgency of activism as a kind of violence. And it's not just violence to ourselves, it's violence to the planet, right? So slow down, do it right, take care, right? Put your attention to what needs to happen. What is the wisest next step? It takes some time to decide what that is. It's not obvious. Yeah. So thank you for asking that question. Yeah, I love that. So,
you also talk a little bit about why you feel it's so important to write your own manifesto and have that intentional energy behind it. Could you speak to that a little bit?
yeah, I think with all of the worries that we have and all of the news coming from 24/7 corners of the globe type of stuff, right? This is a new modern moment that we live in. There are so many causes and problems that upset us and so much that we want to contribute to. And the overwhelm of issues, the need we feel to solve all those problems. First of all, it's a symptom of our individualism, right? That like we think if we can't individually solve those problems, we just shouldn't even try, right? That goes back to the pseudo-advocacy effect. But this notion that we are going to somehow contribute to all of these, improving all of these things, just not enough time on the earth. We're only one person. We cannot possibly. And so the manifesto, working on it's sort of like doing a vision board or a mission statement, which you would do for your, if you had a company, you'd do it. Like, what are you really about? So you know what to say no to, right? The no is as important as the yes. If you're going to be effective, there's going to have to be a lot of no. And I know that's kind of paradoxical. I'm trying to be sort of provocative, So the manifesto helps you figure out what the yes is, right? Like I said, the inner work I did to say, that's my area. I'm going to work on that. I'm going to get some skills to support the movement existentially. That means I have to say no to a lot of things that I'm really upset about and I care a lot about. If it doesn't fit into that filter, it's not the most efficient use of my time, or my skills. So I think that's where I think that's where I'm going with the manifesto. Yeah. To figure out what your yes is,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Diana, are there any more questions in the chat?
A question from Suzanne Miller. She's involved with Climate Action Plan with her school. They have a questionnaire to start the process. Do you have any ideas to tie emotions to their plan? That's a simple question, but how do you do that quickly? Yeah. I don't know.
Well, sometimes with climate framing, there's already emotion latent in it. And so my first suggestion is sort of audit the actual questionnaire for your assumptions about the emotional lives of the respondents. That's getting a little bit meta, right? But, right, so like, is there an implicit arc that the questions takes the recipients or respondents through?
Do you want to see the questionnaire? I have it.
Why don't you send it to me? Yeah, send it to me and I'm happy to respond to it, right? Like, is there an arc to it, an emotion arc, right? Like a story arc.
Oh.
And, sort of audit it for its emotion arc. See whether you want to change it.
So what I learned from you tonight was tying this to emotions, and I love that, and stories. So what I'm thinking is to bring stories of throughout the world and share them with the students and get their reactions. What do you think of that, to get them emotionally involved with it?
Well, so on the question of story, so Paul Slovic, who was one of the editors of the Numbers and Nerves book, Paul Slovic did some of the most cutting edge research on risk perception. He was a social psychologist. And he was the guy who came up with all the research to say that one person's story will cause people to donate more to a cause than telling people big numbers. 500,000 people are starving of, dying of malnutrition in this country, right? The numbers that we hear in the news about COVID deaths or what's happening in Pakistan or whatever, the numbers don't actually cause us to have an emotional reaction. Paul Slovic came up with that data, but a single story, one story does, right?
Do you have ideas where to get like stories, or do I just go online and just start?
Climate storytelling. There's something called the Climate Storytelling Project. That is a good resource. Yep. And then from there, there's so many. People are collecting the stories for this very reason, because they want them to be useful for stuff like this. Yeah.
Thank you.
We just have time for a couple more questions, I think, in order to try to stay within our time frame, although I'm sure all of us feel like we could sit here for a while. Janelle, do you have a question? I know you asked if you could unmute and ask yours. So if you do, please go ahead and ask the question personally.
Hi, sorry, my camera's off. I just came from school. But I just really want to thank you for your presentation. I am your target audience. I am a college student dealing with a lot of climate anxiety. And I just wanted to ask you, like, how do I find the balance between wanting to be informed about the stories, like about the climate crisis? Like, a lot of the stories I keep up with are from a scientist named Peter Klamis. And he, although on Twitter he's a lot more angry about the climate crisis, justifyingly so, but like a lot of the information I gain from him is like quite more on the, I guess, for lack of a better word, negative side. But I also want to stay highly informed about everything going on. So I try to balance that out with another climate communicator named Elena Wood, since she shares a lot of like good positive news, but like getting the whiplash from both sides is like kind of overwhelming.
Yes.
I just really want to like help. I want help with finding that balance, especially for my own mental health.
Yes, that's what a beautiful question. And I honor that intention so much. I mean, gosh, if we were all trying to do this, we would be so much better off. So good for you. Yes. So going back to the Venn diagrams, right? We're going to have to hold the both and. The world is really in a terrible place. I am not that hopeful all the time. I live in a pretty, I live with some pretty unpleasant stories. And also, at the same time, I feel called to give joy to the earth as a gift, right? So how do I do that? And I know that my mental and physical health are the best, the best tool I have for the best technology I have for this problem. So with mindfulness, you can spend some time with these different media stories and voices and just feel what happens in your body and whether your energy for the work it feels depleted or not. You do not have to be informed about everything. Your actions and your passion about it are not going to change just because you know more of the details. I don't think, right? So, this sort of like compulsion to be a good witness to all of the problems can actually get us hung up, can get us in a hole. And you don't need to be a good citizen of the world. You don't have to constantly look all of the stuff in the eye. You actually have to spend the time with the stuff that you love, nurturing the stuff that you love. And so my invitation there is both and while you're at it, just feel how that feels to be in those two different stories. When you go and nurture the stuff you love, that you're worried about those bad stories threatening, what happens to your emotional and mental health? Right? So that's the invitation. It's not about denying reality or denying the news at all, right? But there's no way anybody in the world can be held to that kind of standard to know everything that's going on. I would recommend a beautiful poem by Thich Nhat Hanh called The Good News. He says, they don't publish the good news. You make the good news. The good news is right here. The good news is that you can do the good news right now. The good news is you have eyes, you have ears, you have arms, and your daughter's in front of you and you can hold your daughter. That's the good news, right? And here's all the things that bad news. I really recommend that poem. It's beautiful, beautiful. And maybe that'll help you with the little bit of, I don't know how that bad news is really serving what I love, I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We'll just have time for one more question. Melanie, you have your hand up, so I'll pitch it to you. Go ahead and open your mic.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. Anybody who's going to reference Gus Speth and Joanna Macy and Mariana Heglar, we're on the same page, and so thank you. I collaborating and being in community those two things are so key to making progress, I think, in what we're trying to achieve, and keeping that connection and that joy. It's a challenge because it's so different to our pre-COVID world, I guess, if you will. In some of my climate communities, we have from time to time had folks who I guess I would call doulas in a way, who are really good at holding space to share and listen and lift and process. But that playing that role can burn people out, and yet it seems essential. I wonder if the work that you're doing is almost moving in a direction of training up folks to serve that critical role. You know, people who are good, kind facilitators, people who listen well, people who help us all process and stay together and on that track.
Yeah.
It's a hard job, and you're in it. And I just wondered if you see it as an emerging field.
It is. It's an emerging field, and sometimes people call it climate coaching. The Climate Psychology Alliance is training people now. You can get a climate psychology certificate out of California Institute for Integral Studies. There is a whole groundswell of people who this is their passion. And for so long, it felt like to have any effect on climate, you had to be a politician or a scientist, or maybe an engineer or something. And now it's completely open. Everybody, right? The doulas, have a role, the healers, the midwives, the hospicers, not that that's a word, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Everybody.
Good.
Hawkins says every job a climate job, but some of these aren't even jobs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, as much as I hate to bring this to an end, I think we need to, just to respect and honor everyone's time. Thank you again so much for being here and sharing this time with us. It's been very special. I don't know if you've seen some of the notes and comments, but everybody put in the chat how you feel about what you heard tonight, or open your mics and say thank you and applaud and just show your appreciation for Dr. Ray being with us today. So,
Thank you so much.
thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Thank you.
it. All right, guys, I'm going to sign off and actually go eat dinner. So you guys take care. Have a good evening. And thanks for joining.
Thanks, Diana.
Good night.
Night.